Welcome to On the Ground for Palestine and Israel for the week of May 28, 2022, brought to you by Kumi Now. Today's episode comes out a day later than usual as we travel to Jerusalem to meet with some of our Sabeel and Kumi Now colleagues in person. That also allowed me to walk around the old city and see what was happening on the ground as Israeli settlers and Palestinian protesters prepared for the planned Flag Day March. We didn't personally witness any clashes Saturday night or Sunday morning around Damascus Gate, but confrontations have already started, and there is a lot of concern that events later in the day on Sunday will ignite widespread violence and could lead to attacks from Hamas and reprisals from Israel, as happened last year. One video circulating on Twitter shows an elderly Palestinian woman being spit at, where the road intersects with Via Dolorosa, while another video shows a young woman being pulled into the guard station at Damascus Gate and beaten by soldiers before she is handcuffed and taken to jail. And on Sunday morning, dozens of right-wing Israeli settlers, led by the extremist Itamar Ben-Gvir, and accompanied by squadrons of Israeli soldiers, stormed the courtyards of Al-Aqsa Mosque and invaded the sanctuary spaces, forcing out Muslims in prayer. The annual parade in Jerusalem celebrates Israel's capture of the Old City in the 1967 war and has been occurring annually for 30 years. The planned route begins at Damascus Gate at the north end of the Old City, the main gate in East Jerusalem used by Palestinians, and ends at the Western Wall. Prime Minister Naftali Bennett confirmed on Sunday that the parade would go ahead as planned, but organizers had been talking about bringing the march to the Temple Mount, a request that had been denied, so we'll see what happens. This is very much a developing story, so by the time you're hearing this, the parade will have happened and much more besides, and I'm sure we'll discuss the aftermath of the march in next week's episode. Second, a 15-year-old Palestinian, Zaid Mohammed Ghanim, was shot and killed by Israeli occupation forces Friday evening in the village of Al-Khader, near Bethlehem. The Palestinian Ministry of Health said he was hit by gunshots in the back and neck. He was rushed to the hospital in critical condition, but was later pronounced dead. Wafa reports that eyewitnesses stated Zaid was surprised by the presence of Israeli occupation soldiers in the village, and that he was shot as he tried to hide in a parking garage. Next, the Electronic Intifada reports the European Union is making Palestinian cancer patients suffer as part of a campaign to appease the Israeli lobby in Brussels. The EU is withholding some $230 million in funding previously committed to support Palestinians living under Israeli military occupation. The payments have been delayed since last year as, quote, the European Union continues to condition the release of the money on specific changes to Palestinian school textbooks, according to the Norwegian Refugee Council. A reported 500 or more newly diagnosed cancer patients have been unable to access treatments at occupied East Jerusalem's Augusta Victoria Hospital as a result, while others are experiencing severe delays receiving critical treatment. Now, if you've been following the news or this podcast the last few weeks, you may have noticed that this week's Flag Day celebration comes just days after the funeral of Shireen Abu Akleh, which featured video of Israeli occupation soldiers ripping Palestinian flags from the hearse and attacking Palestinians carrying the Palestinian flag. Over at 972 magazine, Orly Noy has an article that argues that this is part of an intensifying war against the Palestinian flag, a war that is happening despite, or perhaps because of, an Israeli court ruling that states that it was perfectly legal to wave the Palestinian flag. I won't provide her full analysis here, but I suggest you look at the links in the show notes and read her full article. Meanwhile, Haaretz reports that Israel has lifted many of the travel restrictions placed on residents of a Palestinian town after 3 weeks. The village of Ramallah was home to the 2 Palestinian men who murdered 3 Israelis in the city of Elad in early May. Following the murder, Israel barred all residents from the town from entering Israel, reportedly to avoid copycat attacks. But Haaretz states that the 3-week ban was unusually long, and the military has never before imposed such sanctions on the residents of an entire village for such a long time. The mayor of Ramallah, Hassan Sabikat, argues the ban amounted to collective punishment, punishing the 80% of the men in the town of some 4,000 people who work in Israel by denying them access to their jobs. Furthermore, 206 relatives of the assailants still remain barred from entering Israel, meaning that the collective punishment continues. Our final news story of the week takes us to Masafar Yatta, or, as it is known to the Israeli government, firing zone at 918. You may remember that the 20-year legal battle of the Palestinian villages in the region came to an end when the Israeli Supreme Court ruled in favor of the IDF, which had declared the area a firing range. The Guardian now reports that demolitions have begun. Last week, 11 homes and businesses in the village of Fakiet were demolished, and another 9 structures in Al-Majaz were demolished by bulldozers. Roughly 60% of the West Bank is under full Israeli control and referred to as Area C, and 18% of Area C is designated as firing zones by Israel. Meanwhile, The Guardian reminds us that, according to Israel's own figures, only 75 building permits have been granted to Palestinians living in Area C since 2006, while 20,500 have been approved for Israeli settlements ruled illegal under international law. This brings us to our first story on international activism as, in response to these demolitions, 83 Democrats from the House and the Senate of the United States on Thursday wrote a letter urging the Secretary of State, Antony Blinken, to prevent Israel from evicting the more than 1,000 Palestinians living in the Masafariata villages. Finally, Mondoweiss has republished a letter from faculty and officers of Harvard University in support of the university paper's endorsement of the BDS movement on April 29th. Following that endorsement, an editorial from over 150 Harvard faculty members was published, criticizing the initial editorial endorsing BDS. While one university paper supporting Palestine may not seem like much, this may, given Harvard's prestige, be an important moment in the ongoing debate on campuses in the United States and around the world regarding support for Palestine and the BDS movement. And that's the news for this week. As I mentioned earlier, it is currently a tense time in Israel and Palestine. I hope that next week, and by the way, we should be back to our planned Saturday schedule. I hope that next week we will be reporting that the Flag Day events and provocations and clashes have not led to wider violence in the region. Until then, we appreciate all of the thought and action that you dedicate to Palestine. Every bit of it matters. On the Ground for Palestine is produced by Kumi Now, an initiative of Sabeel Jerusalem that is focused on nonviolent solutions to occupation based on international law. This week, Kumi Now focuses on the heartbreaking tragedy of child fatalities. We have a webinar this Tuesday at 6 p.m. Palestine time with Bassem Arderman of Parents Circle Families Forum and Combatants for Peace. Information on the webinar, Kumi Now, the newsletter, and everything else is available in the show notes in your podcast app or in the information below this video on YouTube. If you like this weekly roundup, we suggest you join us at kuminow.com, follow us on social media, and join our weekly Kumi Now newsletter. You can sign up at kuminow.com/register. You can let us know what you think of this news roundup by emailing us at kumi@kuminow.com. We thank you for your role in activism for Palestine and Israel, for only together may we rise up.